Welcome, everyone, to the Gospel Edge. My name is Gary Comer, and we are continuing just a conversation as the title of this podcast goes. We are interested in having conversations related to the gospel, the spread of the gospel, the meaning of the gospel, and what's happening in the church and what's happening with believers. And so today I have a special guest. He's a student. I am teaching evangelism and disciple making strategies over at Talbot Seminary. And Cameron Harp is one of my students, and I've invited him to come in, and he's the first of several students who are going to jump in and participate with the podcast. And so I happen to know a little bit here about Cameron, and that he came and visited me this last semester from the previous semester, and he wanted to come in and really to share really the praise about the impact that he has had since the class in reaching some people with the gospel. And so we're going to dive into that today, and we're really kind of looking forward to learning some things and interacting about some things. But yeah, he's a student, but I thought I'd have him just share just a little more about himself.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. My name is Cameron, and I'm a student here at Talbot Seminary at Biola. I'm an MDiv student with spiritual formation focus, and kind of just been out having a heart for the unreached. A lot of old friends that are non-believers, even people that I meet, Planet Fitness or the mall or even at the parks. I do a lot of prayer walking and do a couple different short-term missions trips as well overseas to just pray for people and to share the gospel, to share the hope that we have and the good news. So.
Do you have aspirations towards the mission field? Is that a part of your future picture?
Yeah, hoping to do some long-term missions in either Bangladesh or India.
Okay.
I'm open to wherever the Lord leads us. I've been to both of those places twice now, for some short-term work, and really have a heart for the Bengali people. It's the largest people group that is unreached, and there's not many people that go to that kind of place in the world. So,
It's awesome. Awesome. So, well, we're looking forward to getting into this here today. It's funny. I've had a little bit of reflection. I've been posting out a series of emails and blogs that have been related to some of my observations from the class at Talbot. This upcoming fall will be my 7th year there. So, I've been there long enough to make some observations, with the students and kind of a little bit of what's happening with the church. And so that's interesting. And so, but, as I've been doing these posts and, we've been kind of getting a little bit of content out there, related to the gospel. It's funny. One of the interesting things that I deal with, as somebody who, really in a way, God kind of in a way backed me into writing and in a way, began to do something in me fresh, some years back about, how do we teach evangelism today, and how do we deepen it? How do we re-enlist the church into it? How do we get people excited about the mission of God and the calling of God? And I have to say, and I thought I'd get your thoughts on this, Cameron, but it's funny. It's, the gospel advance is not the hot topic. You know what I mean? It's almost like, I'm posting things out almost on a regular basis, that are somewhat related to understanding the kind of relationship that we need to have with people and the kind of communication that we need to have with people to reach more people. And yet, boy, I tell you, that kind of subject matter sometimes can't even get a hearing. And so it's certainly not the thing that people gravitate towards, right? And so you and I might gravitate towards it, but it is interesting. I find myself wrestling with that, not in a judgmental way, but just almost in a practical way. Like, how is it that how can we light a fire? How is it that the church can gain a greater vision, that believers could gain a greater vision for really what their Christian formation is about? Because we can be inwardly focused. We can tend to think about ourselves and our own spiritual well-being and our own spiritual formation, our own spiritual nurture, the things that we want to learn, and yet sometimes we're just kind of again focusing on ourselves, and it becomes this ongoing thing that is not filled out in some ways that we see in the life of Christ. And that's the thing that I think is an angst for me, and it's a struggle. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I bump up against that kind of a little bit of frustration too, that there's not enough people doing the work and sharing the gospel and kind
Mm-hmm.
of sharing their faith, especially if it's that important and significant to them.
Mm-hmm.
They often share, sports conversations or their favorite team, but they won't share about Jesus, who has significantly changed their lives. And I've pondered about that, and I think there's a common theme that comes up is people don't want to offend another person or say something to upset someone. And that to me is just like shows maybe the lack of technique and training that how to actually witness. Because you could talk anything and not be offensive to somebody and disagree with them, but yet still love on them and respect them. So I think that is just there's more to it than that. And I think there's four main things that I come up against is the comfort of like the American dream has bled into the Christian dream. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just a comfort in, going to church on Sunday, having a weekly Bible study, and then even a brunch group that you go out with on Sunday afternoons. And that's like the ideal Christian um, ideal. And I think that is kind of what's hurting people is they're just comfortable in what they've already had, and they think that that's what we're actually called to do is just to be in the body of church. But if we're obedient to the commands of the Bible, we're actually to share our faith everywhere we go. And so the second thing that comes up is just a lack of confidence in their own ability or in their own identity. And I think that we should actually embrace that as something to be like, we're actually not able to do that. Or people say, I can't do that, or I'm not called to do that. And I challenge that and I say, yes, you are. But they're like, I don't have the skills or the techniques, or I'm not made for that. And I'm like, well, in your weakness is where Christ's power and his grace is sufficient. So
Mm-hmm.
lean into that. Like, I would imagine that Peter and John weren't out making disciples of fishermen, right? They weren't evangelists until they walked with Christ and leaned on Christ to do these works. So I think that's a thing, this lack of confidence is something that needs to be embraced instead of like avoided or fearful of. And then the third thing, which is I think is probably the biggest thing, is this lack of hearing from Jesus, like specifically talking to people. Um, I hear all the time that like the Bible is where God speaks the most. And I push back on that. And I think the Bible is where God speaks, yes. And he speaks the most clearly in that. But if we limit God to speaking only through the Bible, then unless we have our Bible with us, we can't hear him speak, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we could practice and getting people to understand how to actually hear from Jesus or their thoughts are actually from Jesus, if they're walking closely with them and discerning that, I think that would then allow them to then combat all these American dreams and the lack of confidence and all these other issues that they run up against of not knowing what to say or how to do it. If we could teach people to hear Jesus speak to them and then call upon him as they're out witnessing, that would like catalyze the whole church. And so I've always wondered how many people actually hear from Jesus. And then something that I almost don't want to know the statistic of is how many pastors and leaders actually hear from Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think something that could revolutionize the church is if we practiced discerning and listening and in times of prayer and teaching different types of prayer to where it's not just a petition or an intercession, but it's actually a listening and receiving from Jesus too. And then the fourth one with the younger generation is it's a lot of parents that they're trying that don't want them to go. So the younger generation is trying to be obedient to their parents and honor their parents, but yet they have this calling to go to the nations or to do outreach, but their parents just don't want their child to do it. They believe in the Great Commission. They want it to see Jesus come and the good news to be spread, but they just don't want their child to be doing it. So those are the four main things that I've come up against in what I've seen is the lack of drive in the church and the local body to be reaching out to others who are lost.
So much good in all of what you just shared, and a lot of challenge, like you just really provided like almost a mirror back to us, like what a mirror is supposed to be is to see ourselves and to look at ourselves for corrective means, no, oh my goodness gracious, I really appreciate the depth of thought, and perspective there. My mind was going as you were sharing about listening to God and hearing from God. It's fascinating to look at John, the Gospel of John, and John's depiction of the relationship that Jesus has with the Father. I have called it the leading Father to the shadowing Son. And so, like Jesus says, I do nothing, I do nothing outside of, following the voice of my Father. And there is this picture of intimacy, this close intimacy. And the context of him sharing all that is not him going to the temple and having another Bible study, right? It's not that. The context of the leading Father and the shadowing Son is the mission of the Son, of what am I here to do? I am on assignment from the Father. I have this great calling over my life, and every day counts, and I am here to reach out beyond, the religious gathering to reach to the lost and to cross all these boundaries and to be able to communicate with people where they are and be effective. And honestly, when you look at all that, like you're a spiritual formation student, and so, for me, one of the things that I have tried to do with Soul Whisper as well as Remission, Game of Pulpits has got all of that too. But, really my books and my writing is, I've tried to marry spiritual formation to mission. Yeah. And that is a really different measure of discipleship. It causes, and I think if church leaders could really get their heads wrapped around that, this is the vision that we have for our members, our disciples. We want them to be more like the heart and soul and the manner of Jesus, who's on mission from the Father, on assignment to bring the good news, to this lost world, this world that the Father loves, these people that the Father loves, your neighbor, your, the friend, your workmate, whoever it is, your family member who doesn't, how do we embody that? Because that's really what is driving Jesus, that's where Jesus is at. And so, anyways, I think you were saying that and sharing that, as well as some, the other practical kind of things that are going on. Yeah, parents, oh my goodness gracious, the American dream, right? Wow, this is what we want for our kids, and we want the great American dream, and they're going to be also happy. And, like you look at that through kingdom lens, and it's like, boo, let's get rid of all of that junk. And let's get to the heart and soul of how do we live a life of sacrifice and a life of love for others, not this American dream thing, right? Like what is that? Where did that come from, right? Go ahead.
I think you're exactly right, is rethinking what the church is for. It's a lot of times we want to just retain people and keep people in the church, but if we read Acts, it says to train and equip them and then send them out. So it
Hmm.
should be like a revolving door of discipleship into missional approach. Of like that should be the end goal. And I'm just constantly reminded of like what is heaven like and what are the things that we can't do in heaven. We won't be doing missions in heaven, so that has to be one of the main reasons that we're still on this earth is to do missions. It's that just to me is so clear that the reason we're still here is to bring more people into the kingdom.
Hmm.
That's one of the very few reasons that we're here on this earth is to focus on saving more people and introducing them to a relationship with Jesus that starts today.
Oh man, yeah, and I'm with you. And it's easy, it's easy to just live your life outside of that. And so, and I'll confess to that too. I have to kick myself in the butt too as well. Gary, come on, like, hey, you only got one life, and you live in here, and you get neighbors over here, and you've got some meaningful contacts with some people who are outside the faith. We have a mosque that's very close to my home, by the way. I happen to know the imam there, and I mean, there's opportunity to do this very thing of why we are here. Why didn't he just bring us home immediately? Whoa, we have a purpose. We're here to do his work, to fulfill his work. And you know what? You know what I really like about that too? Sometimes we want to appropriate everything to ourselves. The forgiveness that's come to us, the cross, the covering that's come to us, the grace that's come to us. It's so wonderful. But Jesus went to the cross to save people. I mean, not just to save us, not just us. And it's the extent of the vision that we need to get a hold of. This extent continues. This Jesus's desire to reach more and to bring more in. So,
Yeah, and as we're trying to become more like Jesus in his character, we also have to consider becoming more like Jesus in a vocation of what he did, of just missional. We have to have more of his heart for the lost and more of his drive and purpose for our own lives to match his. And I think that's often just kind of ignored in the body of Christ and the local church is that they want to be more character of all these good things in themselves, but to what end, right? We're supposed to be a blessing to others, and if we're not going to others to bless them with the good news and with everything that God's done in our life with testimonies and faith, then we're not living out who God's made us to be and who He's created us to just serve others and to introduce them into all the favor and blessings that God has for them individually.
and I love what you're saying there too. And it's one of the things that I've driven at times. It's we can't forget the gospel. I don't care where you are, because the gospel is what opens up all of the love of God and all of the blessings of God. Without the gospel, we can be nice, we can be kind, we can we can be this, we can be that. But without the gospel, it's the gospel, the news, and people responding to that news, that they then are the experiential recipients of his grace and all the gifts that are in there, all the infinite blessings. So, yeah, we can't forget it, right? It's why he was clear in a way giving us this great commission at the end. He makes a declaration at the end. This is what I want you to do. Go do this. Bring this out. Fulfill what I did. I made the payment. Go fulfill my work to bring my love to the world. So now I want to gospel edge here. I want to kind of get into a little bit more some specifics with you. And so one of the things I know about you when you came over to the class is you told me on that day, and I don't forget something when people say something like this. I will never forget it. But you came over that day and you said, yeah, this year, Gary, Professor Dr. Comer, I wanted you to know. I've led 3 people to Christ, this year, and I was like, so you need to know this. You need to know this. Uh, when I wrote Soul Whisper, okay, first time writer, you write a book, and you think, of course, the entire world is going to be wanting to read this book, and it's going to be this massive, great seller, and of course it's not, and it's just kind of out there, but the reviews on the book came in, and they started to come in, and they're always pretty encouraging. But I had something that happened to me early on, and one of the members from Sandals, his name's Scott Brennan, came over to me at an event. We were at a baseball game, and he came over to me and said, "Gary, I want you to know, I recently read your book, and I want you to know, in Boston this summer, I led 3 of my friends to Christ." And so when you said 3, I immediately thought of Scott. And it's interesting. I've had some pastors try to kind of nail me down, like, where are all the churches that have run with your program and run with the Soul Whisper concept, and where's all the stories of all them reaching all those people? And it's funny, it's like I do have a whole number of churches that have done things. I don't always have the reports on that kind of stuff to say. I don't always have the reports to say that, wow, that church, like, whoa, they reached all these people. I don't even really know. I trained with a small group, and the small group of 10 ended up in 6 months leading 5 people to Christ. It was like, whoa, that was just like unbelievable, story after story that happened. But it's not easy in a church when you do a training to know exactly what all the fruit is, because I'm not there. I'm not tracking with it. Sometimes what I see is individuals having fruitfulness. And if you can get enough individuals in a church having fruitfulness, then you can see these stories grow, right? And it's almost like, isn't that what we're kind of trying to do? Sometimes the leadership isn't there at the church. It's just not there. Beyond the attractional vision, we'll reach people through our service. The vision isn't there enough to equip, to train, to walk their people into the relational evangelism kind of approach that I teach. And so sometimes you might not see it, or sometimes the church might not notice. They might not even be measuring what is happening on the impact side, or even celebrating it. So anyways, I just say there's lots of different ways it can fall down in the church. But I am encouraged when I hear individuals who've seen success. And I wanted to kind of ask you and, allow you to share what happened that year, and maybe share a little bit if there's particular things you applied that are specific, that are instructive, share those things.
Yeah. Learning from Soul Whisper and just in the class I think the thing that really stuck out for me was 2 things that before I even started evangelizing was that most people come to faith through a family member or a friend. It's like significant. And so that was one of the first pillars that I had to kind of like get across of like, oh, we have to actually love these people to gain the influence to then be able to share even any perspective. And so that's kind of what I always tell people is like you have to know this person and then speaking into their needs and their dreams or their hurts or whatever they need, that the gospel key that you mentioned about is what will lead them into wanting to know more about this, about Jesus or the gospel or about our faith. And so those two,
Let me stop you right there. You see,
yeah,
so for listeners, who are here, so Cameron just mentioned something, the gospel key. Okay, that's a skill. Okay, that is something that we're teaching that was practiced by Christ. Okay, his way of reading people and then customizing a pinpointed message to them based off their needs and their storylines. So that's a skill that we teach. And so I didn't want that to be just missed. because it's not something that most Christians practice. They don't, but it's actually very, very potent. Of course, it was taught by us by Jesus. Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, and then the second thing that really clicked for me is that we never know the impact that the person that we will reach is going to have for the kingdom. And even if we reach one person, we could be potentially saving thousands of generations for their children, and they could be
Mm-hmm.
saving other people. So you have this exponential impact on the kingdom for just reaching one person. And so that really like got me fired up and excited about doing evangelism. And so taking the relational model that we learned to just become friends with people, hear their story, and just kind of talk to them naturally about their life and about my faith and having spiritual conversations about that has what allowed me to then influence people. And
Mm-hmm.
there's different techniques that we used, but it's oftentimes just getting to know the person, hearing their stories, and then sharing my faith, like what's has happened in my life and my testimony to that matches and aligns with what they need to hear or is in congruence with what they're saying. And so it's not giving them a whole gospel message in 10 minutes or whatever. It's asking them questions and then speaking to that about the promises of Jesus or the scriptures that would align to that or comfort them or even just personal testimonies. And so the first person that I used this method on was an old supervisor. I used to be a ski lift mechanic um, in Winter Park, Colorado, and I would talk to him every Sunday on the phone. And then one day I just started using these kind of approaches of just kind of, hey, where are you at with your faith? And kind of just talking. And over the course of the semester, I ended up getting him into a Bible study. He works on Sundays, so he can't attend church. But he goes every Tuesday to Bible studies, and he's been going over 2 years now. And he's even brought somebody else from his work to the Bible study as well. So this approach of just kind of talking to him about life and my life and
Mm-hmm.
whatever's going on, and then introducing and sprinkling in just little faith conversations. And now we talk every Sunday, and most of the time it's about his faith now.
Mm-hmm.
And we still talk about his family and his job and everything and his rock climbing and all these other good things. But almost every week we're sharing what he's learning in scripture, what his Bible messages on in Bible studies and what I'm learning. And we just bouncing back and forth with questions. And he's now doing this with others too.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just highly encouraging because I he left the faith a while ago, and to see him back in the faith and just to see the transformation that's happened in his life and his just excitement and joy and passion for the Lord is just so soul satisfying.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah. Yeah. Natural communication is one of the things that we were trying to do. Is how do we how do we interact with others in a way that doesn't feel forced and it doesn't feel awkward. So what you're alluding to, I think, this idea of, in a way, listening to them and where they're at, and then also connecting, somewhat of along the lines of life experience, and then integrating, sharing some of faith, your faith perspective, that's a part of your life, and yet is relevant to what you're talking about, or relevant to needs, relevant to a situation, relevant to life. So being able to do that, I find that is not an easy thing for people to do, and so one of the reasons why I do a lot of emphasis in Soul Whisper on you know in a sense, honesty and authenticity, and being able to be even vulnerable, even to open up and share a little bit more of your life, your struggles, could even be your sins. I mean, it can go that way. One of the reasons why I give a lot of attention is because it's natural. it's a way for us to talk naturally about the meaning of faith. And I think that in Gospel Key does that too. It's kind of like zeroing in on the relevancy of it to a person, like to their situation. And so these are skills that we're trying to kind of develop these, so that like with you, and I think it's true. I met one of the other gals that you had led to faith over at the Talbot conference. We were over there talking, and I met her, and I sense that same thing where you're kind of jumping in and kind of like getting into that conversation with them, but it's the fact that you're getting to the heart of where they're at and where they're living that makes it powerful. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. That that girl that you're speaking of, she actually is enrolled in Talbot now too. But um, I met her and spent probably 5 hours one evening just talking to her. And
Mm-hmm.
part of that, halfway through the conversation, I was like, Lord, you know how much I need to get done with schoolwork and business stuff and all these other things. But if you want me to talk to her, I will. And so I just kind of listened to her story and was like, oh, yep, I've been there. I've dealt with that problem. I've been in this frustration in this situation as well. And they're different situations, but they have the same underlying theme of struggling with, faith or what to believe, or even just trying different religions or meditations and stuff back before I was a believer. Could then just relate to them and just hear them out. And it's like, and ask good questions. It's like, oh, and what has that done for you? Or where did that lead you? Or what are you still lacking in these things? And then speaking into what Jesus can meet their needs of. And it's just getting to the heart of things. And to
Can
do
I
that,
can I stop you for a second?
yeah.
So that particular technique that he just applied right there, we put names on all these things partly because the gospel matters, right? And we're wanting to reach people, but we call that the end line. The end line. Well, where did that take you? Like, well, did that bring about what you wanted, in your life? So okay, you pursued that, where did that go? It's really effective. It's really effective because it gets people to think, oh man, I didn't go anywhere with that.
Yeah.
Like, oh, what did that do? Right?
And I think you have to do it in a way where there's trust already
Hmm.
and that comes from being vulnerable. And
Yeah.
you're asking in a curious way, not in a judgmental way or like, oh, I have a problem to fix it with this person. You're just journeying along with
Hmm.
them, and that's the
Good,
key.
good, good.
Um, and then another approach that I used that we talked about is circling back. You could ask like an endpoint question like you're talking about, and you can see them thinking about these things, and sometimes they'll either shut down or they kind of like just it's kind of stalls the conversation because they've never thought about this before and they need more time. So then I would circle around with like, oh, so tell me more about this, and kind of like lighten up the burden or the heaviness of the conversation, and then kind of talk about that, getting to know more about them, and then circle back around in a different way of like, hey, so earlier I seen that you were really puzzled by that, or I'm really thinking about that. Is there more that you want to discuss or explore with that? So it's never pushing, it's more inviting.
Yes, and thank you for making that distinction. And sometimes when people hear about me talking about skills or techniques, it could seem a little bit like that. But everything that I felt led of God to teach came out of not only study of Scripture and study of Jesus, but came out of some of my own journeys. And I made a transition in my own life to really believing that in our postmodern time, if we're going to reach people, if we're going to make disciples, we need relationship. We need relationship with people. And it's out of relationship that people can actually kind of do that processing that they need to get to a place where they would actually be able to hear the gospel, the good news of the gospel, and with the gospel key, and it's like open something like want to respond to it, versus, oh, whoa, you should do this. No, I want this. I want this. They're the Samaritan woman who's so excited. Whoa, living water, man. This is good news. Like, yeah, this is great. And so, but yet it's such an art, like in what you're talking about. It's a relational art in a way, but the Holy Spirit's there and over you and over, and God loves people, and God wants to use us to reach them, so, and it's one of the thrilling things, you can, pastors are thrilled about their churches, like, wow, look at our building and look at our services and look at our worship team and, all this stuff. But the thing that's so thrilling, I think, about the gospel and about the calling of ordinary Christians is that God is employing you. God is giving you the gospel. You have a role. And, these beautiful stories that we see in the Bible, well, you're fulfilling those stories in the history of the church when you engage for the gospel, right? Isn't?
Yeah. Yeah, it's some of the most rewarding and purest joy that you can ever get is seeing someone come to the faith or even grow in their faith in a new, brand new way and wanting to share their faith. It's just like, ah, God is so proud of you,
Yeah.
And yeah, it's amazing. It's definitely something that brings lasting joy as well. Like I can think back on all these moments and they just well up the joy that's inside of me to overflow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unlike any other thing that I mean, we all know that the things in this material world don't really satisfy us. And if they do, it's not for a long time or it causes harm. But sharing the gospel and sharing our faith is something that continually renews that joy in me. And it just is always in a beneficial way of encouraging more faith or just bringing a depth of relationship with Jesus every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and I think it's also that thing that we have to be very intentional with. I think about that in my own life. I'm grateful that God has given me, gifted me some opportunities to journey with some people. Way back, this was before Soul Whisper was written, I had that opportunity with two different skeptics, um, an atheist and then a theistic skeptic. And suddenly I'm meeting with two different people separately, one at just the coffee place, every week. And we're just meeting every week. And, and he was an atheist. I'd never, I had never done that before. I was kind of like just, saying, let's give this a try and let's just see where this goes. But what started is like getting to know him, and spending some time and getting to know him, listening to him, where he was at and, why he believed as he did or, lack of belief, right? As far as in God. And then getting a chance to kind of frame up, like, hey, why don't we look into an argument for the existence of God? And so ended up jumping into Mere Christianity's, like that whole conversation about human conscience. And we talked about that for about 4 months, it was a long time. We went back and forth, but 7 months in, and then he's come a long way. He's like and I'm thinking, and his wife is like, wow, and then he comes to this critical impasse. I just can't believe, I there's all sorts of reasons for me to believe, but I just can't get there. And then God, said, it was like, okay, would you be willing to pray and, ask God to reveal himself to you? I never would have asked him that question early. If I had done that earlier, it would have been a big zero. It would have been a big no. But we had made this investment of journeying together. And his heart was at the place where he was open to say prayer and to ask God, if he would reveal himself. And boy, I tell you, and I'm like, I'm at the end of myself, and all the last follicles of hair are coming out. I was really at the end of myself, but God broke it open. Yeah. God, he prayed that prayer, and God revealed himself in the circumstances of his life, where he said, I can't even explain what happened. That must have been God. And I was like, don't you think that God is reaching to you? Why, we've met and talked about all this. Don't you think that God is, you know what I mean? It's like, and I love that the line, the soul whisper line, uh, you know, your words, God's voice. Yeah, your words. Wow, God's voice to somebody. Powerful, isn't that? That we are actually the vessels that God uses, to bring His message to people. I love it. But they both came into the faith, and when that happened, then I began to look at everything very differently. Yeah. So, and then the book and all that, but but I just want to say I'm encouraged by your faithfulness. I see God working in you. I saw that in the class time too. But it is exciting, Cameron, to see you being faithful, and to see how God is using you. And I know God's going to use you to teach others. And so it's not just reach someone and reach someone else, but it's you being able to equip others. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just, I guess one last thing is that you touched on it real quick is you prayed. And I think that is a significant piece of reaching someone. It's because we're not speaking our words, we're speaking God's words through our voice. And it's about asking God, who should I try to be connecting with? Or who should I be reaching out and starting this relationship with in my network that I already know? And then you can move outside of that and asking before you meet with this person, okay, God, what is it that you want me to speak to this person? Or what is the themes that I should be paying attention to as they're speaking to me that we could speak into? Because Jesus is like a surgeon. He knows exactly what to say and when to say it. And if we're asking him, then it's makes our job a lot less fearful because we know that we're speaking what God wants us to say. And it makes it just more confidence in knowing that it's his power and it's his faith that brings people, not anything that we're doing. We're just showing up and being obedient and being flexible in what we need to be saying and how we could be saying it. We're just listening with one ear to the Lord and one ear to the conversation that we're in.
It just brings it back to that intimacy with the Lord, modeled so beautifully by Jesus. But just, yeah, the intimacy of us seeking Him, partnering with Him. The Lord is the one who saves, but He wants to use us, and that's a beautiful thing. I do appreciate too just the idea, hey, you have to be intentional about getting together with somebody outside the faith, and we call that framing, frame up a time to get together. But that's kind of sets the foundation for you to have a conversation. We say, have a conversation about having a conversation. Hey, how'd you like to get together, and talk and allow the Lord to lead you, to guide you, just as Cameron really just shared right there. Very beautiful. All right. Well, this is the Gospel Edge, and a chance to kind of interact about what God is doing through His good news in the world. Cameron, thank you so much for being with us and blessing all the listeners here today. God bless everyone.
Take care.